The massive observation deck of Kepler Station stretched out like a crystal dome against the star-filled void of space. Admiral Jake Morrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the alien ships arrive one by one through the viewing ports. Each vessel that emerged from hyperspace was more impressive than the last, their hulls gleaming with technologies that humanity could barely understand. Captain Lisa Harper stepped up beside him, holding a datapad with the latest intelligence reports. She was young for her rank, but had earned her position through years of tactical brilliance in the outer colonies. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was perfectly pressed despite the long journey to reach this gathering point. The Zephyrian fleet just dropped out of hyperspace, she reported quietly. 12 ships, all Crystal-class destroyers. Their hulls are practically glowing with some kind of energy field. Morrison nodded but said nothing. He had seen pictures of Zephyrian vessels before, but witnessing them in person was something else entirely. The ships looked like they were carved from pure diamond, their surfaces refracting the light of nearby stars into brilliant rainbows. They moved with impossible grace, seeming to dance through space rather than fly. And the Chronari? Morrison asked. 6 dreadnoughts, each one the size of a small moon, Harper replied. Our senses can barely get a reading on their armor plating. Whatever metal they use, it's nothing we've ever encountered. The Chronari ships were the opposite of the elegant Zephyrian vessels. They were massive, angular blocks of dark metal that looked like floating fortresses. Gunports dotted their hulls like the eyes of some ancient beast, and energy discharges flickered along their surfaces as their weapon systems powered up for the demonstration to come. A soft chime echoed through the observation deck, followed by an announcement in multiple languages. The Galactic Defense Summit was about to begin. Morrison straightened his uniform jacket and checked his cum device one last time. As the representative of Earth and all her colonies, he carried the weight of humanity's reputation on his shoulders. The conference room was enormous, with a circular table that could seat representatives from dozens of species. Holographic displays showed real-time tactical information about the Void Hunter threat, including grainy footage of destroyed worlds and the few surviving eyewitness accounts. The atmosphere was tense as delegates filed in, each species clustering. With their own kind, Morrison and Harper took their assigned seats in what was clearly the least prestigious section of the room. The human delegation consisted of just the 2 of them, while other species had brought entire retinues of advisors, scientists, and military officers. The message was clear. Humanity was barely worth acknowledging. Commander Zethkar of the Chronari was the first to address the human presence directly. He was nearly 8 feet tall, with gray skin that looked like it was made of stone and 4 arms that ended in clawed hands. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke. So these are the famous humans we have heard so little about, Zethkar said, his words drawing chuckles from several other delegates. Tell me, Admiral Morrison, how many ships has your species contributed to our joint defense force? Morrison stood slowly, meeting the alien commander's gaze without flinching. 12 vessels, Commander. Our best ships and crews. The laughter that followed was not kind. High Counselor Vexana of the Zephyrians was particularly vocal in her amusement. She was tall and thin like all her people, with skin that seemed to shift colors like oil on water. Her large eyes held an intelligence that was both ancient and condescending. 12 ships, she repeated, her voice like music played on crystal bells. How quaint. Our science division alone has contributed more vessels than your entire species. And what class of ships are these? Surely not your primitive chemical-powered relics. Morrison felt Harper tense beside him, but he remained calm. A mix of battleships and cruisers, Counselor. Some are indeed older designs, but they have served us well for over 2 centuries. This admission brought even more laughter. A delegate from the insectoid Thrax species clicked his mandibles in what Morrison assumed was their version of mirth. Even the usually stoic Valdorians seemed amused, their ancient faces showing the slightest hint of smiles. Chemical propulsion, Zethkar said, shaking his massive head. Kinetic weapons? metal armor plating. These are technologies we abandoned when we first reached for the stars. How do you expect such primitive vessels to stand against the Void Hunters? Harper leaned forward slightly, her voice steady despite the insults being hurled at their fleet. Our ships may use older technology, but they're reliable. When a Zephyrian quantum drive fails, the ship is dead in space. When one of our fusion reactors goes down, we have backups. When those fail, we have backups for the backups. Vexanas. Laughter was like breaking glass. Redundancy is the hallmark of inferior design, young captain. When one achieves true technological advancement, such crude failsafes become unnecessary. The Thrax delegate chittered something in his own language before switching to the common tongue. Perhaps the humans should be assigned to cargo transport duties. Their vessels would be well suited for moving supplies while the real warships engage the enemy. Morrison had heard enough. He stood again, this time with an edge to his voice that cut through the mockery. Our ships may not be as advanced as yours, but they've never lost a battle when the odds were even. Every human vessel in this fleet is crewed by veterans who fought pirates, raiders, and worse in the outer systems. We may not have quantum drives or plasma cannons, but we know how to fight. The room fell silent for a moment before Zethkar's laughter boomed out again. Fighting pirates is hardly the same as facing the Void Hunters, Admiral. These creatures have destroyed fleets 100 times more advanced than anything your species has ever produced. The tactical display in the center of the room shifted to show recent battle footage. Entire Zephyrian task forces had been obliterated. In minutes. Chronari dreadnoughts that had never known defeat were reduced to drifting hulks. The Void Hunters moved like nothing the galaxy had ever seen, their biomechanical ships seeming to absorb energy weapons and regenerate from physical damage. "This is what we face," Vexana said, her tone becoming more serious. "Creatures that have perfected warfare over millions of years. Your chemical rockets and metal bullets will be like throwing pebbles at a tsunami." Morrison studied the footage carefully, noting how the alien ships moved and fought. He saw something in their patterns that the others seemed to miss, but he kept his observations to himself for now. Instead, he simply nodded. "We understand the threat, Counselor. That's why we're here." The meeting continued for several more hours as battle plans were discussed and fleet positions assigned. As Morrison had expected, the human ships were relegated to the rear guard, positioned far enough back that they could retreat quickly when the main battle was lost. It was a position of shame disguised as one of safety. As the delegates filed out, Zethkar approached Morrison one last time. "I bear you no ill will, human. Your species simply lacks the tools for this kind of warfare. When the real fighting begins, fall back quickly. There is no shame in recognizing one's limitations." Morrison watched the massive alien leave, then turned to Harper. She was studying her datapad with a troubled expression. "What are you thinking, Lisa?" he asked. "I'm thinking they're all making the same mistake," she replied quietly. "They're so focused on having the best technology that they've forgotten the most important rule of warfare." "Which is?" Harper looked up at him with a slight smile. "It's not about having the best weapons. It's about using the weapons you have in ways your enemy doesn't expect." Morrison nodded slowly. In 3 weeks, they would find out if humanity's old ways could stand against the galaxy's newest nightmare. Looking out at the gathering fleet of advanced alien vessels, he couldn't help but think that the Void Hunters were in for a surprise. 3 weeks had passed since the summit on Kepler Station, and now the combined fleet hung in space at the edge of the terminus, nebula like a constellation of deadly stars. Captain Danny Brooks stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty, watching through the main viewport as alien vessels maneuvered into formation around them. Even after all these years in space, the sight of so many different ships working together still amazed him. The Zephyrian destroyers moved like dancers, their crystal hulls catching and bending the light from the nearby binary star system. They seemed to flow through space rather than fly, their quantum drives leaving trails of shimmering energy that looked almost alive. Each ship was a work of art as much as a weapon of war, with curves and angles that followed no human understanding of engineering. Brooks turned his attention to the Chronari dreadnoughts that formed the heavy battle line. Each massive vessel was larger than 3 city blocks and bristled with enough firepower to level a continent. Their dark metal hulls absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making them look like holes torn in the fabric of space itself. Gunports ran along their sides in neat rows, each one housing weapons that could punch through a moon. The Valdorian cruisers were perhaps the most mysterious of all. Ancient beyond measure, they seemed to bend reality around themselves, their hulls flickering in and out of normal space as their probability drives kept them partially phased. Brooks had heard that a single Valdorian ship could be in 12 different places at once, though he had never seen it proven. Lieutenant Commander Kelly Stone approached from the communications station, her boots echoing on the metal deck plating of the Liberty. The ship was old enough that her great-grandfather might have served aboard her during the colony wars, and she showed her age in every rivet and weld mark that decorated her hull. "Captain, we're receiving another round of betting. Pools from the Chronari ships?" Stone reported with barely concealed irritation. "They're taking wagers on how long our squadron will last once the shooting starts." Brooks smiled grimly. The alien crews had been making jokes about the human fleet since the moment they had arrived. Compared to the sleek vessels around them, the 12 human ships looked like museum pieces that had somehow wandered into the wrong century. The UES Liberty herself was a Titan-class battleship that had been launched nearly 200 years ago. Her hull was a patchwork of different metals where battle damage had been repaired over the decades. Armor plating from a dozen different worlds covered her vital sections, and her weapon systems had been upgraded so many times that no 2 guns were exactly alike. Captain Rick Martinez's ship, the UES Defiance, was even older. She had started life as a heavy cruiser during humanity's first expansion into deep space. The generations of modifications had turned her into something unique. Her hull was scarred from countless battles, and jury-rigged equipment covered every available surface. To human eyes, she was beautiful in her functionality. To the aliens, she was an embarrassment. Commander Nino Walsh commanded the UES Courage, a destroyer that had been built specifically for raiding operations in the outer systems. She was fast and tough, with enough firepower to take on ships twice her size. Her crew was known throughout the human fleet for their ability to improvise solutions to impossible problems. Brooks walked over to the tactical display that dominated the center of the bridge. Chief Engineer Pete Johnson was hunched over a maintenance console, making final adjustments to systems that the aliens couldn't even identify, let alone understand. Johnson was old enough to remember when the Liberty was considered cutting-edge technology, and he knew every bolt and wire in her hull. "How are we looking, Chief?" Brooks asked. Johnson looked up from his work, grease stains marking his weathered face. "She's running better than she has in 20 years, Captain. Whatever those alien fancy pants think of our gear, I guarantee you our reactors will still be running when their quantum drives are nothing but expensive paperweights." The chief engineer had spent the last 3 weeks going over every system on the ship with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He had replaced components that were merely old rather than broken, rerouted power conduits for maximum efficiency, and loaded the ammunition magazines with rounds that had been crafted specifically for this mission. Through the viewport, Brooks could see the other human ships making their own final preparations. The UES Patriot was running weapons drills, her point defense guns tracking imaginary targets with mechanical precision. The used Valor was cycling her missile tubes, checking and rechecking the guidance systems on warheads that most species had abandoned centuries ago. A communication came through from Admiral Morrison aboard the command ship UES Constitution. The Admiral's voice carried the calm authority that had made him legendary among human military circles, even if the aliens saw him as nothing more than a representative of a backward species. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison. Intelligence. Reports suggest the Void Hunters will emerge from hyperspace within the next 6 hours. Final weapons checks are authorized. Remember, we may not have the fanciest equipment in this fleet, But we have something they don't. Brooks activated his ship-wide communications. This is the captain. You all heard the admiral. We've got 6 hours to make sure every system on. This ship is ready for whatever comes through that nebula. Chief Johnson, I want those reactors running so smooth they purr. Commander Stone, run diagnostics on all communication arrays. If we're going to show these aliens what human ships can do, everything needs to work perfectly. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role in the complex dance of preparing for battle. These were not fresh recruits, but veterans who had served together for years, fighting pirates and raiders in the lawless regions where alien patrol ships feared to venture. From the observation deck of a nearby Zephyrian vessel, High Counselor Vexana watched the human preparations with barely concealed amusement. She had invited several other commanders to witness what she called the Primitive's final inspection. The gathering of alien officers found great entertainment in watching the humans crawl over their ships with tools that belonged in museums. Look at them, commented Commander Zethkar, his forearms gesturing dismissively at the human fleet. They are actually using mechanical torque devices to tighten physical fasteners. I have not seen such crude maintenance procedures since my people first achieved spaceflight. A Thrax observer clicked his mandibles in agreement. Their weapon systems are particularly amusing. Chemical explosives propelled by magnetic acceleration. How do they expect such ancient technology to function against biomechanical armor? That can regenerate faster than their primitive projectiles can damage it? Vexana nodded, her color-shifting skin displaying patterns that indicated condescension among her people. The humans will provide an interesting first course for the Void Hunters. Perhaps watching these primitives being destroyed will give us useful data about enemy tactics before the real battle begins. Back aboard the Liberty, Chief Johnson finished his final systems check and reported to the bridge. Every indicator showed green, and the ship's fusion reactors hummed with the steady rhythm that had been their song for 2 centuries. The ammunition lockers held rounds designed specifically for penetrating biomechanical armor, though Johnson doubted the aliens would appreciate the ingenuity behind their construction. Captain Brooks took his position in the command chair as the countdown began. Around them, the magnificent alien fleet prepared for a battle they were certain they would win with their superior technology and advanced tactics. They had fought the Void Hunters before and lost, but they were confident that this time would be different with their combined forces. The human ships hung in space, like ugly ducklings among swans, their crews ready to prove that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. In less than 6 hours, the galaxy would learn that humanity had not survived its violent history by accident. They had survived because they knew how to fight. When fighting was the only option left, Brooks looked out at the alien fleet one more time, then activated the internal communications. All hands, this is the captain. In a few hours, we're going to show this galaxy what human ships can do. Let's make our ancestors proud. The first sign of the Void Hunters was not visual, but something far more disturbing. Every sensitive aboard the Allied ships suddenly screamed in unison as reality itself seemed to twist around the edge of the Terminus Nebula. The space that had been empty moments before began to ripple like water, and then the nightmare emerged from hyperspace. Captain Danny Brooks felt his stomach drop as the enemy fleet materialized before them. These were not ships in any sense that human engineering could understand. The Void Hunter vessels looked like they had been grown rather than built, their hulls pulsing with veins of dark energy that made them appear alive. Some were shaped like massive insects with wings that flickered between dimensions. Others resembled sea creatures from humanity's deepest oceans, their tentacles reaching out to taste the vacuum of space itself. Admiral Morrison's voice crackled across all frequencies, steady despite the horror they were witnessing. All ships maintain formation. Remember your orders and trust your training. Lieutenant Commander Kelly Stone stared at her sensor readings with disbelief written across her face. Captain, I'm counting over 300 vessels. They're not showing up properly on our scopes. It's like they're only partially here. The largest of the Void Hunter ships was something that defied description. It moved through space like a Living shadow, its hull absorbing the light from nearby stars and somehow making the darkness around it even deeper. Smaller vessels swarmed around it like flies around a corpse, their biomechanical surfaces shifting and changing as they prepared for battle. Hi. Counselor Vexana's crystal destroyer was the first to open fire. Beams of concentrated plasma lanced out from her ship's weapons, each shot carrying enough energy to vaporize a small asteroid. The weapon struck the nearest Void Hunter vessel dead center, and for a moment the assembled fleet thought they had scored the first victory. Then, the enemy ship's hull simply absorbed the energy like a sponge soaking up water. Where the plasma beams had struck, new growths appeared on the vessel's surface, as if the attack had somehow fed it rather than damaged it. The creature ship turned toward the Zephyrian destroyer with something that might have been curiosity, and then it returned fire. The weapon that emerged from the Void Hunter vessel was unlike anything in the galaxy's databases. It looked like liquid darkness given form, a beam of pure void that seemed to erase everything it touched. When it struck Vexana's ship, the crystal hull didn't shatter or melt. It simply ceased to exist, leaving a gaping hole where solid matter had been. Moments before, alarms began screaming throughout the Allied fleet as more Void Hunter ships opened fire. The Chronari dreadnoughts responded with their massive guns, sending shells the size of shuttlecraft toward the enemy formation. Commander Zethkar's flagship fired a barrage that should have been enough to crack a moon, but the Void Hunter vessels moved with impossible speed, dodging attacks that should have been unavoidable. When the Chronari shells did find their targets, they struck hulls that seemed to flow like liquid metal. The impacts created massive explosions that lit up the void, but when the light faded, the enemy ships were already healing. Wounds that should have been fatal closed up within seconds, and new weapons sprouted from the damaged areas. Like metallic flowers blooming in fast motion, the Valdorian cruisers tried a different approach, using their probability drives to attack from multiple dimensions at once. For a brief moment, it seemed like their strategy might work as enemy ships found themselves under assault from directions that didn't technically exist. But the Void Hunters adapted with terrifying speed, their biomechanical systems somehow learning to track targets across dimensional barriers. Captain Rick Martinez watched from the bridge of the UES Defiance as the alien fleet began to crumble before his eyes. Ships that had seemed invincible an hour ago were being torn apart by weapons that operated on principles no one understood. The graceful Zephyrian destroyers were being hunted through space by creatures that moved like predators stalking prey. "This is insane," muttered Chief Engineer Pete Johnson aboard the Liberty. "Those alien ships have every advantage you could ask for, and they're getting slaughtered." Brooks nodded grimly as he watched a Thrax heavy cruiser simply vanish from his sensors. One moment it was there, the next it was gone without even the courtesy of an explosion to mark its passing. The Void Hunters were not just destroying the Allied fleet. They were erasing it from existence. The enemy's tactics were as alien as their technology. Instead of forming traditional battle lines, the Void Hunter ships moved in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to appear and disappear at random, striking from impossible angles before melting back into the darkness of space. Their weapons fired in sequences that made no tactical sense but somehow achieved devastating results. Commander Zethkar's voice boomed across the communication channels, filled with a desperation that the proud Chronari warrior had never known before. "All ships, fall back to secondary positions. Our weapons are having no effect. Repeat, fall back immediately." High Counselor Vexana's response was barely audible through the static of her damaged communications array. "Zephyrian fleet is taking massive casualties. Request immediate withdrawal to safe distance. These creatures are beyond our capability to engage." The retreat began in earnest as the surviving alien ships tried to pull back from the Void Hunter advance. But the enemy was not content to simply watch them go. The biomechanical vessels pursued the fleeing ships with single-minded determination, their dark energy weapons reaching out to claim more victims. Captain Nina Walsh's destroyer, The UES Courage was positioned to observe the battle from the rearguard position that the humans had been assigned. She watched in horror as ships that had seemed like gods of war were reduced to scrap metal in minutes. The technological marvels that had mocked humanity's primitive vessels were proving useless against an enemy that fought by no known rules. "Admiral," Morrison's voice cut through the chaos with calm authority. "Human fleet, maintain position. Do not engage until ordered." Stone looked at Brooks with confusion. "Captain, shouldn't we be falling back with the others? Those things are tearing apart ships 10 times more advanced than ours." Brooks studied the tactical display, noting the patterns in the enemy's movement. There was something about the way the Void Hunters attacked that reminded him of animal behavior rather than military strategy. They seemed to be testing their opponents, learning from each exchange of fire. "Negative," Brooks replied. "The Admiral knows what he's doing. Besides, look at how they're fighting. They've adapted to energy weapons and exotic technologies, but notice what they haven't encountered yet." Johnson looked up from his engineering station with sudden understanding. "They haven't faced anything like our weapon systems. Chemical, explosives, kinetic projectiles, nuclear warheads. To them, we probably look like we're carrying stone knives and bare skins." The alien fleet continued its desperate retreat as more ships fell to the Void Hunter advance. In less than an hour, nearly half of the galaxy's most advanced warships had been destroyed or disabled. The creatures that had emerged from the nebula seemed unstoppable, their biomechanical technology adapting to every weapon fired at them, but as the human ships maintained their position in the rear guard, something interesting began to happen. The Void Hunters slowed their advance, seemingly puzzled by the 12 vessels that showed no fear and made no attempt to flee. For creatures that had evolved to hunt and destroy advanced technology, the sight of ships that looked like ancient relics was apparently confusing. Brooks smiled for the first time since the battle began. "All right, boys and girls, time to show these things what happens when you bring space magic to a gunfight." Admiral Morrison watched the slaughter unfold before him with the cold calculation of a man who had seen too many battles. The alien fleet was in full retreat now, their advanced ships fleeing from an enemy they could not comprehend or defeat. But Morrison had noticed something that the others had missed in their panic. The Void Hunters were not pressing their advantage as hard as they could. They seemed almost confused by the 12 human ships that remained motionless in their assigned position. The biomechanical creatures had evolved to hunt and destroy the most advanced technology in the galaxy, but the sight of vessels that looked like museum pieces apparently puzzled them. "Captain Harper," Morrison said into his communicator, "signal. All ships, execute attack pattern Delta 7. Captain Lisa Harper, now serving as Morrison's tactical coordinator, felt her heart race as she relayed the order. Attack pattern Delta 7 was something from the old colonial wars, a formation designed for engaging multiple enemies with inferior firepower. No one had used it in over a century because modern warfare had made such tactics obsolete. Captain. Danny Brooks received the signal aboard the UES Liberty and smiled grimly. Delta 7 meant they were going to charge straight into the heart of the enemy formation, exactly the kind of insane plan that had made human Marines legendary throughout the outer colonies. "All hands, battle stations," Brooks announced over the ship's internal communications. "Chief Johnson, I want every reactor online and every gun loaded. We're about to show these things what Earth steel can do." The 12 human ships began to move forward in a formation that would have made their ancestors proud. The U's Liberty took point, her scarred hull gleaming under the distant starlight. Behind her came the other vessels, their crews ready to prove that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. The Void Hunters initially ignored the approaching human ships, focusing instead on destroying the fleeing alien vessels. Their biomechanical systems had cataloged the energy signatures of Zephyrian plasma weapons, Chronari particle beams, and Valdorian probability cannons. They had adapted defenses against all known forms of advanced weaponry. They had no defenses against a tungsten rod moving at 20% of light speed. Brooks gave the order when the Liberty was within optimal range. "Main guns, fire." The Ships' primary weapons were magnetic railguns that had been built when humanity first reached for the stars. They used magnetic fields to accelerate metal projectiles to incredible velocities, turning simple chunks of tungsten into weapons of mass destruction. The technology was so basic that most alien species had abandoned it before they learned to walk upright. The tungsten rod struck the nearest Void Hunter vessel with the force of a nuclear explosion. Unlike the energy weapons that the creature ships could absorb, the kinetic impact was something their biomechanical systems had never encountered. The projectile punched through the hull like it was made of paper, and the explosive payload that followed turned the creature's internal structure into molten metal. For the first time in the battle, a Void Hunter ship died completely. No regeneration, no adaptation, just a massive explosion that lit up the void like a new star. The other human ships opened fire in sequence, their magnetic accelerators sending a storm of metal death toward the enemy formation. Captain Rick Martinez's Defiance unleashed her full battery of railguns, each shot precisely targeted at a different enemy vessel. Commander Nina Walsh's courage added her firepower to the barrage, her smaller guns spitting tungsten bullets at rates that would have made ancient machine gunners weep with joy. The Void Hunters reacted with something that could only be described as shock. Their biomechanical minds had evolved to counter energy weapons and exotic technologies, but they had no protocols for dealing with what amounted to very large bullets moving very fast. Their adaptive armor, designed to absorb and redirect energy, was useless against chunks of metal that simply punched through and exploded inside their hulls. Lieutenant Commander Kelly Stone watched her sensors with amazement as human weapons began tearing through the enemy formation. Captain, we're getting solid hits on every target. Their hulls can't adapt to kinetic impacts fast enough. But the railguns were only the beginning. Commander Stone's ship, the UES Patriot, had been equipped with weapons that the galaxy had not seen in centuries. Nuclear-tipped missiles streaked away from her launch tubes, their chemical engines leaving trails of fire against the starfield, the void. Hunters tried to intercept the missiles with their point defense systems, but the weapons moved in ways that made no sense to their advanced targeting computers. Instead of following predictable energy signatures, the missiles used simple chemical guidance systems that were impossible to jam. When they struck their targets, the nuclear explosions created electromagnetic pulses that wreaked havoc on the biomechanical systems of the creature ships. The electromagnetic radiation was particularly devastating because the Void Hunters had evolved in deep space where such phenomena were rare. Their organic systems, perfectly adapted to absorb energy weapons, had no defenses against the broad-spectrum radiation produced by nuclear explosions. Ships that had shrugged off plasma cannon hits began to convulse and die as their nervous systems were fried by electromagnetic interference. Captain Martinez brought the Defiance in close for what human tacticians called a knife fight. His ship was built for close-range combat, with armor plating thick enough to ram through asteroid fields. As Void Hunter vessels tried to engage him with their dark energy weapons, Martinez simply charged straight at them. The alien creatures had never encountered anything like a ramming attack. Their biomechanical minds could not comprehend why any ship would deliberately collide with an enemy when long-range weapons were available. When the Defiance struck a Void Hunter vessel at full speed, the creature ship simply crumpled like an empty can. Chief Engineer Pete Johnson had been right about human engineering philosophy. When a Zephyrian quantum drive failed, the ship was helpless. When a Chronari particle cannon overheated, the vessel had to withdraw from battle. But when human systems took damage, they kept working through sheer bloody-minded determination. The Liberty took a direct hit from a Void Hunter energy weapon that should have crippled her. Instead, the ancient armor plating absorbed the blow, while backup systems automatically rerouted power around the damaged sections. Johnson's voice crackled over the intercom with grim satisfaction. Hull breach on Deck 7, but we're still in the fight. These old girls were built to take punishment. Admiral Morrison coordinated the human attack with the skill of a conductor leading an orchestra. Each ship played its part in a symphony of destruction that the galaxy had not heard for centuries. The Void Hunters, masters of adaptation and technological superiority, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with weapons they could not counter and tactics they could not understand. The battle began to turn as more Void Hunter ships fell to human weapons. The creatures' biomechanical systems tried desperately to adapt to kinetic impacts and nuclear explosions, but the damage was too severe and too varied. They had evolved to counter the sophisticated weapons of advanced civilizations, not the primitive but effective tools of a species that had learned to fight with whatever was available. Captain Brooks watched as another enemy vessel exploded. Under the combined fire of 3 human ships, the Void Hunters were beginning to retreat, their formation breaking apart as they encountered weapons that their ancient minds had never imagined. For the first time in their existence, they were afraid. All ships, press the attack, Morrison ordered. Show them what happens when you underestimate the human race. The tide of battle shifted completely as the human fleet pressed their attack deeper into the Void Hunter formation. What had started as a demonstration of primitive weapons was becoming a masterclass in tactical warfare that the galaxy had not witnessed for centuries. Captain Lisa Harper coordinated the human ships from her position aboard Admiral Morrison's flagship. Using battle tactics that predated faster-than-light travel, the Void Hunters were experiencing something they had never felt before in their millions of years of conquest. Fear, their biomechanical minds, evolved to counter the most sophisticated weapons in the galaxy, could not adapt quickly enough to the crude but effective arsenal that humanity brought to bear against them. Captain Danny Brooks brought the UES Liberty around for another attack. Run, her hull scarred but intact despite taking hits that would have vaporized more advanced vessels. The ship's ancient fusion reactors hummed with steady power, their simple design proving far more reliable than the complex quantum systems that had failed throughout the alien fleet. Chief Engineer Pete Johnson's voice echoed through the Liberty's corridors as he coordinated damage control efforts. Reactor 3 is running at 110% efficiency. Hull breaches sealed on decks 4 and 7. All weapon systems operational. These old reactors just keep going when those fancy quantum drives would have given up hours ago. The difference in engineering philosophy was becoming clear as the battle raged on. When Zephyrian ships took damage, their crystalline hulls either held perfectly or shattered completely. When Chronari dreadnoughts were hit, their sophisticated systems either worked flawlessly or failed catastrophically. But human ships were built to take punishment and keep fighting. Commander Nina Walsh's destroyer, the UES Courage, had lost her main engines 30 minutes into the battle. Instead of withdrawing, Walsh ordered her crew to use the ship's maneuvering thrusters and emergency chemical rockets to continue the fight. The Void Hunters watched in confusion as a supposedly crippled vessel continued to attack them with weapons that should not have been able to function. Captain Rick Martinez demonstrated the effectiveness of human boarding tactics when his ship, the Defiance, came alongside a damaged Void Hunter vessel. Instead of trying to destroy it from a distance, Martinez launched assault pods filled with Marines armed with kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. Sergeant Alex Cooper led the boarding party into the biomechanical corridors of the enemy ship. The Void Hunters had evolved defenses against energy weapons and technological warfare, but they had no experience with humans carrying shotguns loaded with depleted uranium slugs and backpacks full of plastic explosives. Move fast and hit hard, Cooper ordered his Marines as they fought their way through passages that seemed to pulse with alien life. These things adapt to everything, but they can't adapt to a 12-gauge slug in the face. The Marines moved through the creature ship like a plague, destroying vital systems with weapons that the Void Hunters could not understand or counter. When the enemy tried to seal off sections of their ship, the humans simply blew holes in the walls with explosives. When biomechanical defenses tried to stop them, they responded with flamethrowers and grenades. The concept of boarding actions was so foreign to the Void Hunters that their biomechanical systems had no protocols for dealing with enemy soldiers inside their ships. They had fought space battles for eons, but they had never encountered an enemy crazy enough to actually climb aboard their vessels and fight hand-to-hand in the corridors. Captain Harper watched the tactical display with growing amazement, as human forces achieved the impossible. Ships that had been written off as obsolete were systematically destroying an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. The key was not superior technology but superior tactics and an understanding of how to use simple weapons effectively. The UES Patriot, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Kelly Stone, demonstrated another advantage of human engineering when her quantum communication array was destroyed by enemy fire. Instead of losing contact with the fleet, Stone's crew switched to radio transmissions, a technology so primitive that the Void Hunters did not even recognize it as a communication method. "All human vessels, this is Patriot Actual," Stone broadcast, on frequencies that had not been used for military purposes in over 100 years. "Enemy is regrouping near the gas giant. Recommend Wolfpack tactics, approach from multiple vectors." The Wolfpack formation was something from humanity's early space wars, designed for smaller ships to overwhelm larger opponents through coordinated attacks. Admiral Morrison smiled as he heard Stone's recommendation. The young commander had recognized that ancient tactics were exactly what this situation required. The 12 human ships split into 3 groups of 4, each group approaching the enemy from a different direction. The Void Hunters tried to respond to the multiple threats, but their biomechanical coordination systems were designed for fighting in large formations against similar opponents. They had no experience with the kind of fluid, improvised tactics that human crews had perfected over centuries of fighting pirates and raiders. Chief Johnson's modifications to the Liberty systems proved crucial as the battle intensified. While alien ships suffered cascading failures when their advanced systems were damaged, the Liberty's redundant backups kept her fighting. When her primary targeting computer was destroyed, the crew switched to manual fire control. When her quantum sensors failed, they used optical telescopes and radar. The Void Hunters were learning that humanity had survived its violent history not through technological superiority, but through stubborn refusal to give up when the odds were against them. Every human ship in the fleet carried weapons and equipment that other species considered obsolete, but in the hands of crews who knew how to use them, these ancient tools became instruments of destruction. Commander Zethkar's voice crackled across the communication channels from his damaged Chronari dreadnought. "Human fleet, this is incredible. How are your primitive weapons so effective against these creatures?" Admiral Morrison's reply was calm and matter-of-fact. "Because sometimes the best technology is the kind that's too simple to break, Commander. Our weapons don't need to adapt because they were never complicated enough to fail in the first place." The battle reached its climax as the remaining Void Hunter ships tried to retreat toward the edge of the system, but the human fleet was not content to simply drive them away. Captain Martinez led a pursuit formation that harassed the fleeing enemies with long-range missile strikes, while Captain Walsh's damaged destroyer somehow managed to keep pace using nothing but chemical thrusters and determination. The final Void Hunter vessel to fall was destroyed by a coordinated attack from all 12 human ships. Railgun rounds, nuclear missiles, and conventional explosives converged on the biomechanical creature simultaneously, overwhelming its adaptive defenses with sheer volume of different attack types. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. As the last enemy ship died, silence fell across the battlefield. The human fleet hung in space among the wreckage of what had once been considered an unstoppable force. Their hulls were scarred and their systems were damaged, but they had achieved something that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had thought impossible. They had won.